She was judged the moment she arrived. Just as her simple leather sandals met the polished Italian stone of the grand entrance, a security guard stepped into her path, his posture as rigid as the wrought iron gates she had just passed through. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "The service entrance is around the back." Inside, amidst the delicate clinking of porcelain and the murmur of practiced pleasantries, Veronica Sterling would later lean across a table laden with silver and scones, her voice a sharp, polished weapon. "My dear, you look more like you're here to audit the books than to sip Earl Grey." The women at her table would titter, their laughter like the shattering of fine glass, none of them knowing who she truly was, or that the quiet power she held could dismantle their gilded world with a single, seule décision. Alara Vance stood at the threshold of the Crestwood Estates, the afternoon sun casting a warm, honeyed glow on her unadorned face. Her cream linen dress, simple in its cut but exquisite in its fabric, fell to her mid-calves, swaying gently with the breeze that whispered through the meticulously sculpted cypress trees lining the driveway. Her hair was tied back in a low, loose knot, a few errant strands framing a face that was serene and observant. In her hand, she held not a designer clutch, but a simple canvas tote bag. Printed on its side in a faded forest green were the words, "The Oak Ridge Community Arts Collective," a memento from a fundraising drive she had personally spearheaded, a project closer to her heart than any diamond. The frayed edges of the tote's handles were a quiet rebellion against the gleaming, ostentatious wealth that surrounded her. The Crestwood Estates was not merely a country club, it was a fortress of privilege, a sprawling sanctuary where Chicago's elite gathered to insulate themselves from the mundane realities of the world. It was a place of manicured perfection, from the impossibly green lawns of the golf course to the sparkling, chlorinated blue of the Olympic-sized swimming pool. The air itself seemed different here, scented with the expensive perfume of blooming magnolias and the subtle, intoxicating aroma of old money. The security guard, a broad-shouldered man named Henderson, whose uniform was starched to an uncomfortable stiffness, held a clipboard like a shield. His gaze traveled from Alara's simple sandals up to her makeup-free face, and his expression hardened with skepticism. He saw not a guest, but an anomaly, an error in the carefully curated guest list of life. "Your name, please?" he asked, his tone implying he was merely going through the motions before turning her away. "Alara Vance," she replied, her voice calm and even. The name held no tremor of anger or indignation, only a quiet statement of fact. Henderson's thick finger traced down the list. He scanned it once, then a second time, his frown deepening. The walkie-talkie on his hip crackled with static, a sound that seemed to amplify the awkward silence. Alara stood patiently, her posture unwavering. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly on the worn handle of her canvas tote. It was a familiar feeling, this quiet, dismissive judgment. She had felt it before, in other rooms, in other exclusive circles she moved through by virtue of her marriage, not her wardrobe. Inside her mind, she heard the gentle, loving voice of her late mother. "Dignity is a fortress you build from the inside, Alara. Let their words be stones that bounce off its walls." The memory was a comforting anchor in this sea of silent contempt. She was not defined by the label on her dress, but by the strength of her convictions, a truth these people were incapable of understanding. "I don't see a Vance on the list for the summer gala tea," Henderson stated, his skepticism now solidifying into certainty. He looked past her, towards a gleaming black sedan that was pulling up, ready to dismiss her and welcome a guest he deemed more appropriate. "I'm a guest of Ellen Harper," Alara clarified, her gaze steady. Henderson sighed, a sound of profound irritation, and reluctantly lifted his walkie-talkie. Henderson at the main gate. "Checking on a +1 for Ellen Harper. Name's Alara Vance." The reply crackled back, indistinct at first, then clarifying. "Harper's guest is confirmed. Let her through." Without a word of apology, Henderson stepped aside, his eyes still following her with suspicion as she walked past him. Alara offered him a small, polite nod, a gesture of grace he neither expected nor deserved. She walked down the stone path, the soft scuff of her sandals, the only sound breaking the spell of opulent silence. Each step took her deeper into the lion's den. The grand hall of the Crestwood Estates was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings were supported by marble columns, and the walls were adorned with massive, oil-painted portraits of stern-faced club founders, their eyes seeming to follow every guest with silent appraisal. The air was cool, a stark contrast to the warm sun outside, and it carried the faint scent of lemon polish and old leather. Ilara passed a private lounge, where several men in tailored suits laughed over glasses of amber liquid, their voices low and resonant. They were striking deals, forging alliances, shaping the financial landscape of the city within these paneled walls. To them, a woman like Ilara, if they noticed her at all, would be invisible, a part of the scenery, like a well-placed floral arrangement. She found her way to the Sun Terrace, where the gala tea was in full swing. It was a dazzling scene of calculated elegance. Long tables were draped in pristine white linen, set with gleaming silver teapots and three-tiered platters of miniature pastries that looked more like jewels than food. The terrace was a sea of pastel-colored dresses, oversized designer sunglasses, and the incessant, glittering flash of diamonds from wrists, ears, and necks. The sound was a symphony of privilege, the gentle clink of porcelain, the soft bubble of champagne being poured, and a constant, high-pitched hum of gossip and laughter. Ilara spotted her friend Ellen, who waved her over to a table near the edge, overlooking the 18th hole of the golf course. As she approached, she felt the conversation at the table falter. A half-dozen pairs of eyes turned towards her, and in an instant she was weighed, measured, and found wanting. At the head of the table sat Veronica Sterling, the undisputed queen bee of Crestwood. She was a woman in her late 50s, perfectly preserved, with blonde hair sculpted into a flawless chignon. A strand of perfectly matched pearls was clasped around her throat, looking less like an accessory and more like a beautiful, decorative noose. Her smile was a work of art, bright and wide, yet it never quite reached her cold, calculating blue eyes. Seated to her right was Blair Davenport, a younger woman whose family had made its fortune in real estate. She was draped in a silk dress that shimmered with every movement, her face sharp and bird-like, her eyes constantly scanning the room for competitors or prey. Beside her, Cassandra Wexler, whose husband was a new money hedge fund manager, fidgeted with a diamond bracelet that was just a little too large, a little too loud. She was eager to please Veronica, to solidify her place in this exclusive circle, and the easiest way to do that was to join in on the bloodsport of social exclusion. "Ilara, you made it," Ellen said warmly, her kindness a small, welcome island in this ocean of judgment. Ilara smiled, a genuine warmth that contrasted sharply with the practiced expressions around her. "I wouldn't miss it." She took her seat, placing her canvas tote on the flagstone floor beside her chair. The simple action seemed to offend the very air around the table. Veronica Sterling watched her, a slight, predatory smile playing on her lips. She let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the discomfort. Then she leaned forward, her voice carrying across the table, clear and cutting. "My dear, you look more like you're here to audit the books than to sip Earl Grey," she said. The insult was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, wrapped in a veneer of light-hearted jest that made it all the more cruel. Blair Davenport let out a sharp, appreciative laugh. "Oh, Veronica, you're wicked." She then turned her sharp gaze to Ilara. "And that tote bag," she chimed in, her voice dripping with mock curiosity. "Is that from the Oak Ridge Arts Collective? How quaint. I suppose one must support the little people's hobbies." The table erupted in a cascade of brittle, insincere laughter. It was a well-rehearsed chorus, a sound designed to isolate and humiliate. Several women subtly angled their phones, capturing the scene for their private social media groups, captioning it with witty, cruel remarks. In their world, social status was a zero-sum game, and putting someone else down was the quickest way to elevate oneself. A faint flush of heat rose in Ilara's cheeks, a human reaction she quickly suppressed. She did not look down, she did not fidget. Instead, she held their gazes, one by one. She felt the familiar sting of their scorn, but beneath it, a deeper, calmer emotion held firm, a profound sense of pity for them. She saw past the diamonds and the silk, to the fragile architecture of their self-worth, built upon such flimsy foundations as brand names and guest lists. She thought of her husband, Julian. She could almost hear his low, steady voice in her ear. "Let them have their little stage, Alara," he would say, his hand gently covering hers. "They're performing for an audience of ghosts. We're building something real." Julian understood her. He had never once asked her to change, to conform to the ostentatious world his success had thrust them into. He loved her for her quiet strength, for her unwavering commitment to the values they shared, values of substance over style, of integrity over influence. The laughter subsided, leaving a tense, expectant silence. They were waiting for her to crumble. They wanted tears, or a stammered defense, or an angry outburst, anything that would confirm their superiority. Alara calmly unfolded the linen napkin in her lap. She poured herself a cup of tea from the silver pot, her hand perfectly steady. The delicate scent of bergamot filled the air. She lifted the cup to her lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and then placed it back in its saucer with a soft, barely audible click. Finally, she looked directly at Veronica Sterling, her eyes clear and unclouded by anger. "I'm here to enjoy the tea," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's a lovely day for it." The simplicity of her response was a shield they hadn't anticipated. It didn't engage their cruelty. It simply ignored it, rendering it powerless. It was a quiet act of defiance that baffled them. For a fleeting moment, Veronica's perfect smile faltered. She had expected a victim, but Alara was not playing the part. Cassandra Wexler, feeling the need to regain the upper hand, leaned forward with a syrupy, sweet smile. "Well, of course, dear. We're all just so curious. It's not every day we get to meet someone so wonderfully down to earth. Do tell us, what is it that you do?" It was a loaded question, another trap designed to expose her as a nobody. Alara met her gaze, a faint, enigmatic smile touching her own lips for the first time. The sun caught a small, simple, silver locket at her throat, a gift from Julian on their first anniversary. It was her only piece of jewelry, and it held more value to her than all the diamonds at the table combined. The battle was far from over. Their curiosity had now morphed into a more determined, predatory focus. They had failed to break her with their first volley, and now they were regrouping, readying their next attack. Alara knew this. She took another sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her, fortifying the quiet fortress of her dignity. The real storm was yet to come. The question hung in the air, thick and cloying like the scent of the hothouse roses, arranged in a massive silver vase at the center of the table. "Do tell us, what is it that you do?" It was a simple query on the surface, the kind exchanged 1,000 times a day in polite society. But here, at this table, it was not a question. It was a demand for credentials, a challenge for Alara to justify her presence among them. They were not interested in her life. They were interested in her label, a convenient tag they could use to file her away under inconsequential. Alara's enigmatic smile remained, a gentle curve of her lips that gave nothing away. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, the intense, probing curiosity of women who treated social hierarchies as a competitive sport. For a moment, she considered the truth, the full, unvarnished truth. She could tell them about the late nights spent poring over grant proposals for the Croft Foundation, the quiet satisfaction of diverting millions of dollars towards medical research, inner-city arts programs, and environmental conservation. She could describe the weight of the decisions she made, decisions that impacted thousands of lives, a responsibility far heavier than the diamonds glittering on their wrists. But she knew it would be pointless. They would not understand it, or worse, they would not believe it. To them, philanthropy was a performance, a line item on a tax return, a name engraved on a plaque, a photo opportunity at a gala. It was not the silent, tireless, often thankless work she dedicated her life to. To speak of it would be like trying to describe the color of the sky to someone who had lived their entire life underground. Veronica Sterling, impatient with the silence, pressed on. Her manicured nails, painted a fierce, blood red, tapped a delicate rhythm against her porcelain teacup. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of dwindling patience. "Come now, dear. Don't be shy," Veronica cooed, her voice a silken sheath over a steel blade. "We're all friends here. Do you work? Or perhaps you're involved in charity?" She said the word charity with a slight, almost imperceptible curl of her lip, as if it were a quaint and slightly embarrassing hobby, like collecting porcelain thimbles. Charity work can be so fulfilling, can't it? Blair Davenport added, her sharp face alight with patronizing condescension. It must be wonderful to have so much free time on your hands. My schedule is simply a nightmare. Between fittings for the regatta and my obligations at the equestrian club, I barely have a moment to breathe. The memory surfaced, unbidden, sharp and vivid as a shard of glass. 3 years ago, the Crestwood Estates annual fundraising auction. Alara had stood near the back of the grand ballroom, her dress, a simple, elegant column of dark silk, a stark contrast to the sequined and feathered gowns that fluttered around her. She was there to quietly bid on a piece of art on behalf of the foundation, an acquisition for the local museum. She preferred to remain anonymous, to observe. A woman named Beatrice, a notorious gossip whose husband had made a fortune in dubious real estate deals, had sauntered over, a sapphire brooch glittering on her lapel like a malevolent eye. Her voice, loud and piercing, cut through the auctioneer's patter. "Are you one of the catering staff on a break?" Beatrice had sneered, her eyes raking over Alara's simple attire. Before Alara could respond, Beatrice deliberately flicked a crumpled program onto the floor, landing near the hem of Alara's dress. "Be a dear and pick that up for me, would you?" A wave of snickers rippled through the guests nearby. Phones were raised, capturing the casual cruelty of the moment. Ilara's hands had trembled slightly then, a tremor of pure, unadulterated rage that she had fought to control. She had bent down, her movements fluid and graceful, and retrieved the program. Her eyes, when she straightened, locked onto Beatrice's. They were not angry, not tearful, but unnervingly calm. "I am a guest," she had said, her voice low but carrying a strange authority that made the snickers die in their throats. "And I believe you dropped this." Beatrice, taken aback by the lack of a flustered reaction, had simply laughed it off. "Guests at Crestwood don't usually look like they're about to serve the canapés," she had retorted, turning away with a flick of her perfectly coiffed hair. The crowd's laughter had swelled again, but Alara had remained standing, the program held loosely in her hand, her silver locket feeling cool against her skin. She had not won the exchange, not in their eyes, but she had held her ground. She had not allowed their venom to poison her. The memory was a scar, but it was also a lesson, a reminder that their brand of power was hollow, and her brand of strength was invisible to them. The clink of a fork against a plate snapped Alara back to the present. Cassandra Wexler was dissecting a miniature lemon tart with surgical precision, her expression one of intense concentration that suddenly shifted as she looked up, deciding it was her turn to join the fray. "My husband sits on 3 different charity boards," Cassandra announced, a note of misplaced pride in her voice. "It's terribly demanding work, all those luncheons and galas. But it's so important to give back, isn't it?" "What cause are you passionate about, Alara? Animal shelters? The local library?" Her tone was a masterpiece of condescension. It implied that any charitable work Alara might be involved in was, by definition, small, local, and insignificant, the domain of bored wives with nothing better to do. The irony was so thick, Alara could almost taste it, more bitter than the tea in her cup. The local library Cassandra so casually dismissed had just received a 7-figure anonymous grant to build a new children's wing and a state-of-the-art literacy center, a grant that Alara had personally championed and signed off on just 2 weeks prior. Alara felt the familiar pull of 2 opposing forces within her. There was the instinct to defend herself, to wipe the smug, self-satisfied smiles off their faces with the sheer, crushing weight of the truth. She imagined the scene, the dropped jaws, the panicked glances, the sudden fawning shift in their demeanor. The fantasy was tempting, a brief, satisfying flash of vengeance, but a stronger, deeper instinct held her back. It was the voice of her mother again, a gentle whisper in the chaos of her mind. True strength doesn't need to announce itself, it simply is. To reveal herself now would be to play their game, to admit that their validation mattered, and it didn't. What mattered was the work itself. The children who would learn to read in the new library wing, the young artists who would receive grants from the Arts Collective, the patients who would benefit from the research her foundation funded. Her worth was not determined by the opinions of the women at this table. It was forged in the quiet, impactful reality of her life, a life they could not even begin to comprehend. She took a slow, calming breath, letting the anger and frustration wash over her and then recede, like a tide pulling away from the shore, leaving only the smooth, solid bedrock of her resolve. She set her teacup down with deliberate care, the sound a quiet period at the end of their volley of insults. Her hands were steady on the starched white linen of her napkin. She looked around the table, her gaze resting for a moment on each of their expectant faces. Veronica's polished cruelty, Blair's bored arrogance, Cassandra's insecure neediness. "You're right," Alara said, her voice a soft counterpoint to their sharp-edged chatter. "It is important to be passionate about something." She paused, letting the simple statement hang in the air. It was an agreement, but it felt like a deflection. It gave them nothing to latch onto, nothing to tear apart. Veronica's eyes narrowed. She was a hunter, and her prey was refusing to run. "That's not an answer, dear," she purred. "What is your passion? We're all dying to know what occupies your time." Alara thought of Julian, of their quiet evenings at home, far from the glare of the public eye. They would sit in their library, surrounded by books instead of people, and talk for hours about philosophy, about art, about the future they wanted to build not for themselves, but for a world that was kinder, more equitable, more beautiful. She thought of the deep, abiding love that was the true center of her universe, a treasure more precious than all the Croft fortune. This was her passion. This was what she did. She lived a life of purpose, a life of love, a life of quiet, meaningful action. She finally gave them an answer, a small, carefully chosen piece of the truth. "I'm a volunteer," she said simply, "and I serve on the board of a small family foundation." The effect was instantaneous. A collective, almost imperceptible sigh of relief seemed to pass through the women. They had their label, volunteer, small family foundation. It was perfect. It placed her exactly where they wanted her to be, harmless, non-threatening, and socially irrelevant. It confirmed all their initial assumptions. The simple dress, the canvas tote, the lack of ostentatious jewelry, it all made sense to them now. She was a dilettante, a do-gooder, the wife of some moderately successful but ultimately unremarkable man. Blair Davenport actually smirked, a quick, triumphant flash of her white teeth. "How lovely," she said, her voice dripping with finality. She had lost interest. The hunt was over. Veronica leaned back in her chair, a look of serene satisfaction on her face. She had successfully identified and neutralized the foreign element at her table. She picked up a delicate cucumber sandwich, her posture radiating a renewed sense of order and superiority. The social equilibrium had been restored. They turned their conversation to more important matters. The scandalous price of a particular designer's latest collection, the upcoming yacht race in Monaco, the tedious affair of finding reliable staff for their summer homes. Alara Vance, the volunteer from the small family foundation, was summarily ignored, relegated to the background, just another piece of scenery on their sun-drenched terrace. They thought they had won. They thought they had put her in her place. But as Alara sat there in the cocoon of their dismissal, a quiet strength settled over her. They had not seen her. They had only seen a reflection of their own narrow prejudices. And as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn, she knew that their carefully constructed world was about to be turned upside down by the very woman they had deemed utterly insignificant. The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the quiet before the storm. The air on the terrace, once filled with the sharp, brittle sounds of their laughter, was now thick with a suffocating silence. Alara had been dismissed, rendered invisible by their unanimous social verdict. Veronica, Blair, and Cassandra had turned their attention back to the familiar, comfortable terrain of their own lives, their voices a low, exclusive murmur. They spoke of a troublesome yacht captain in street, Bart's, the outrageous cost of stabling a show horse, and the political maneuvering required to secure a front-row seat at Paris Fashion Week. They spoke in a language of extravagant problems, a dialect designed to reinforce their own importance. Ilara sat in their midst, a silent observer in the eye of a hurricane of trivialities. She sipped her tea, its warmth a small, grounding comfort. She was not angry anymore. The sting of their insults had faded, replaced by a profound and weary clarity. She saw them not as monsters, but as deeply insecure individuals. Their cruelty, a desperate defense mechanism against a world they secretly feared, did not value them beyond their net worth. Their power was a performance, and their stage was built on the exclusion of others. It was Cassandra Wexler who inadvertently lit the fuse. Eager to impress Veronica with a final, dismissive jab, she glanced over at Alara, who was looking out towards the serene green of the golf course. "You know, Veronica," Cassandra said, her voice laced with a false, syrupy pity. "It's almost sweet, a small family foundation. It reminds me of a child's lemonade stand. A nice little hobby to pass the time." She smiled, seeking approval from her queen. "My Arthur, of course, finds his philanthropic work with the Global Investment Council so draining. The stakes are just so significant." That was it, the final stone tossed at her fortress. It wasn't the insult to her, but the casual belittling of the work itself, the dismissal of purpose as a mere hobby. In that moment, Alara made a decision. She would not stoop to their level. She would not engage in a war of words. Instead, she would use their own language, the language of power, influence, and unspoken rules, to teach them a lesson in humility. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She reached down to the canvas tote bag they had so openly mocked. Her fingers bypassed her wallet, her phone, and a well-worn book of poetry, searching for a small, leather card holder tucked into an inner pocket. She drew out a single card. It was not flashy. The card was made of a thick, creamy cardstock, heavy and substantial in her hand. There was no gold foil, no elaborate logo. There was only a name, embossed in a simple, elegant navy blue font, the Croft Foundation. And beneath it, two words that were both innocuous and immensely powerful. Oversight Division. A young waiter, who had been hovering nervously near their table, refilling water glasses with downcast eyes, approached. He was a boy of no more than 19, his face tense with the effort of being both efficient and invisible. "Excuse me," Alara said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the drone of the other women's conversation. The boy startled, his eyes widening. He was not used to being addressed so directly or so politely by the guests at these tables. "Yes, ma'am?" She extended the card to him. "Could you please give this to the club manager, Mr. Abernathy? Tell him it's from me." The waiter took the card, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against hers. He glanced at the text, and a flicker of confusion, then dawning comprehension, crossed his face. He had seen the name Croft before, on checks and documents that were handled with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. He nodded swiftly, a new urgency in his posture. "Right away, ma'am." He turned and practically fled, weaving through the tables with a speed that was entirely out of character for the club's usually languid pace of service. Blair Davenport watched him go, a bemused smirk on her face. "Sending a note to the manager? Don't tell me you're complaining about the temperature of the tea." Alara simply smiled her enigmatic smile and took another sip. Less than 2 minutes passed. The women had already dismissed the incident, returning to a heated debate about whether Aspen or Gestad was the superior winter destination. They were mid-sentence when a new sound sliced through the air, sharp and electronic. It was the club's intercom system, a feature reserved only for emergencies or the most critical of announcements. A man's voice, tight with stress, crackled across the terrace, silencing every conversation. "Attention, terrace staff. Attention, terrace staff. Please serve the table of Mrs. Vance according to VIP Protocol Level C. I repeat, Protocol Level C. Effective immediately." The world seemed to stop. The clatter of a silver teaspoon hitting a saucer echoed unnaturally in the sudden, profound silence. Every head on the terrace turned towards their table. Veronica Sterling's hand, which had been lifting a macaron to her lips, froze mid-air. Blair Davenport's jaw went slack, her expression of bored superiority replaced by one of utter, slack-jawed disbelief. Cassandra Wexler's face went pale, a stark white against her heavily applied blush. "Protocol. Level C?" Cassandra whispered, the words barely audible. Even Alara's kind friend, Ellen, looked at her with wide, questioning eyes. Protocol Level C was a thing of legend at the Crestwood Estates. It was a designation so rare, so exclusive, that most members thought it was merely a rumor. It was reserved for visiting royalty, heads of state, and the handful of silent benefactors whose fortunes kept the club's marble halls polished and its coffers full. It meant more than just the finest champagne and the most attentive service. It was a signal, a silent alarm that communicated one thing. The person at this table holds the power to shape the destiny of this club. What Veronica Sterling, in her pearl-choked ignorance, could not possibly know was that Protocol Level C had a secondary, hidden function, one that Julian and Alara had insisted upon when the Croft Foundation had made its last 9-figure endowment to the club. Its activation automatically triggered a discreet but immediate internal review of all current major capital projects and board-level expenditures. It was a fail-safe, a quiet mechanism to ensure their investment was being managed with integrity. And what Veronica definitely did not know was that her own husband, Arthur Sterling, was the board member currently overseeing the club's massively over-budget and suspiciously delayed new wellness pavilion, a project from which he had been quietly skimming funds for months. Alara's simple card, delivered by a nervous young waiter, had not been a complaint. It had been a surgical strike. The shift at the table was seismic. The women stared at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time. The simple linen dress no longer looked cheap. It looked intentional, a statement of quiet confidence. The canvas tote no longer looked quaint. It looked like an emblem of a world so far beyond their own that they couldn't even guess at its rules. Her calm demeanor no longer seemed like weakness. It seemed like the placid surface of a deep and powerful ocean. Their own finery suddenly looked garish, their diamonds desperate, their carefully constructed personas as fragile as spun sugar. Just as the first flustered waiter, now accompanied by a panicked-looking sommelier, began rushing towards their table, a new sound intruded. It started as a low, resonant thrum, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. The silverware on the tables began to hum softly. Heads turned, searching for the source. The sound grew steadily, a deep, rhythmic womp-womp-womp that was utterly alien to the tranquil atmosphere of the Crestwood Estates. Every eye on the terrace lifted towards the sky. Descending from the brilliant blue, like a predator from another world, was a helicopter. It was not a small, cheerful news chopper or a sightseeing vessel. It was a sleek, matte black Augusta Westland AW-109, a machine that screamed power, precision, and immense wealth. It moved with a terrifying grace, its rotor blades slicing the air with a sound that drowned out all conversation, all thought. Guests scrambled to their feet, chairs scraping harshly against the stone terrace. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The helicopter did not head for the designated landing pad on the far side of the estate. Instead, in a breathtaking display of audacity and control, it began to descend directly onto the pristine, sacred green of the 18th hole, not 50 yards from where they Saturday. It was a violation of every rule. A flex of power so absolute it bordered on the surreal. The helicopter touched down as gently as a dragonfly, its engines winding down but never fully silencing. The collective breath of the Crestwood Estates was held in a state of suspended shock. The side door slid open with a smooth, hydraulic hiss. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the bright afternoon Sunday. He was tall and lean, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He paused for a moment at the door, put on a pair of sunglasses, and then stepped out onto the grass, his polished leather shoes leaving the first ever mark on the hallowed 18th green. A murmur went through the crowd, a wave of dawning, horrified recognition. "Is that?" someone whispered. "It can't be," another breathed. It was Veronica Sterling who finally gave the name a voice, her tone a strangled mix of awe and terror. Julian Croft. The name Julian Croft fell from Veronica's lips, not as a statement, but as a surrender. It hung in the air, heavier than the scent of magnolias, more valuable than all the diamonds on the terrace combined. Julian Croft was not merely a member of the elite, he was one of the architects of the modern world, a titan of technology and investment whose influence was as vast as it was invisible. He was a ghost in the machine of global finance, a man who rarely made public appearances, whose photograph was almost never published. To see him here, stepping out of a matte black helicopter onto their private golf course, was akin to witnessing a myth walk out of the pages of a book and into their meticulously curated reality. The atmosphere on the terrace had transformed in an instant. The languid, self-satisfied air of privilege had evaporated, replaced by a thick, palpable tension. Every member of the Crestwood Estates, from the most arrogant board member to the most junior waiter, stood frozen, their roles in the club's rigid hierarchy momentarily forgotten. They were all just spectators now, witnesses to a display of power so profound it reshaped the very landscape around them. Julian Croft moved with an unhurried, leonine grace. He took off his sunglasses, his gray eyes scanning the crowd of stunned faces on the terrace. His expression was not angry, not arrogant, but utterly, unnervingly calm. It was the calm of a man who did not need to raise his voice to command a room or, in this case, a sprawling country club. His gaze swept past the fawning, the fearful, and the frankly starstruck, searching. Veronica Sterling, recovering from her initial shock, saw an opportunity. Her social instincts, honed over decades of climbing the slippery ladder of Chicago's high society, screamed at her to act. This was a chance to connect with power in its purest form. She smoothed down her dress, pasted a brilliant, welcoming smile onto her face, and began to move towards the edge of the terrace, her hand already half extended. "Mr. Croft," she called out, her voice a syrupy concoction of deference and familiarity. "What an unexpected honor. Are you here to inspect the grounds for the new pavilion project? My husband, Arthur, is overseeing it, you know. He would be thrilled to give you a personal tour." Her words trailed off into a mortified silence. Julian Croft's gaze had passed right over her as if she were a piece of furniture. His eyes had found their target. They landed on Alara, and in that instant, the cool, implacable mask of the billionaire investor dissolved, replaced by a look of such warmth, such undisguised affection, that it was more intimate and shocking to the onlookers than any display of anger could have been. He smiled, a small, private gesture that was meant only for her. Ignoring Veronica's outstretched hand and the dozens of other hopeful, pleading faces, Julian walked directly to the short flight of stone steps that led up to the terrace. He ascended them 2 at a time and did not stop until he was standing before Alara. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The crowd watched, breathless, as he lifted her hand to his lips and brushed a gentle kiss across her knuckles. "I'm here to pick up my wife," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried with absolute clarity in the stunned silence. Each word was a perfectly aimed shot, shattering the last vestiges of their world order. My wife. A collective gasp swept through the terrace, a soft, whooshing sound like the wind being knocked out of 100 lungs at once. The revelation was too immense, too utterly paradigm-shifting to be processed immediately. Ilara Vance, the dowdy volunteer, the woman in the cheap dress with the canvas bag, the object of their ridicule and scorn, was the wife of Julian Croft. The blood drained from Veronica Sterling's face, leaving behind a pasty, gray mask. Her hand, the one that had been so hopefully extended, dropped to her side as if it had been broken. Blair Davenport looked as though she might faint, her sharp, bird-like face a comical picture of horror. And Cassandra Wexler, poor, ambitious Cassandra, simply stared, her mouth agape, the half-eaten lemon tart forgotten on her plate. The foundation of their universe had just cracked, and they were all tumbling into the abyss. "Have you been waiting long?" Julian asked Alara, his voice low and gentle, for her ears only. She shook her head, a small, grateful smile finally gracing her lips. "I was enjoying the tea," she replied, a subtle, private joke passing between them. Julian's gaze swept over the women at the table, lingering for a fraction of a second on each of their horrified faces. He did not need to say a word. His eyes, cool and analytical once more, conveyed everything. He saw them. He understood exactly what had transpired here. And in that silent, searing glance, they felt the full, terrifying weight of their misjudgment. They had not just insulted a guest. They had insulted the most important person in the world to one of the most powerful men on the planet. He then turned to the club manager, Mr. Abernathy, who had scurried onto the terrace, his face slick with sweat. "Mr. Abernathy," Julian said, his tone deceptively mild, "the Croft Foundation will, of course, honor its existing commitments to this club." Abernathy let out a shaky breath of relief. "However," Julian continued, the single word cutting through the air like a guillotine, "I will be personally reviewing the entire membership roster and the club's code of conduct. It appears some standards have slipped. My wife values kindness and integrity. Any institution we support will be expected to do the same." It was a declaration of war, delivered with the calm of a business negotiation. It was not a threat, it was a statement of fact, a promise of a reckoning to come. For every person on that terrace, membership at the Crestwood Estates was the ultimate symbol of their success, the cornerstone of their social and professional lives. And Julian Croft had just announced his intention to take a hammer to that cornerstone. Veronica Sterling felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. She thought of her husband, Arthur, and his creative accounting with the Wellness Pavilion funds. A personal review by Julian Croft would be a forensic dissection. Their reputation would be ruined, their finances exposed. They would be pariahs. Blair Davenport thought of her father's real estate company, which was in the middle of a delicate negotiation for a massive loan from a bank in which Julian Croft held a controlling interest. Her casual cruelty at a tea party could very well bankrupt her family. The consequences unfolded in their minds, swift and devastating. Julian turned his back on them all, his attention returning solely to his wife. He gently took the canvas tote from the floor and slung it over his own shoulder, the simple, worn bag looking utterly at home against the fine Italian wool of his suit. It was a final, silent rebuke to their shallow materialism. "Shall we go home?" he asked her. Alara nodded. Hand in hand, they walked away from the table, away from the shattered remnants of the tea party. They descended the stone steps and walked across the immaculate green of the 18th hole towards the waiting helicopter. No one moved. No one spoke. The members of the Crestwood Estates, the titans of industry and the queens of society, stood frozen, like figures in a wax museum, watching as the woman they had scorned walked away with the man who held their world in the palm of his hand. Alara did not look back. As she stepped into the helicopter, the wind from the rotor blades whipping her linen dress around her, she felt a sense of release. It was not the triumphant feeling of victory, but the quiet, profound peace of being truly seen and loved for who she was. The helicopter lifted off, its powerful thrum, a final, definitive statement. It rose into the sky, shrinking to a black speck against the vast, indifferent blue before disappearing from view. On the terrace, a single, hysterical sob broke the silence. It was Cassandra Wexler. Her carefully constructed world had crumbled, and she was left weeping amidst the ruins of miniature pastries and shattered vanities. But no one went to comfort her. They were all too lost in their own private terror, contemplating the ruin they had brought upon themselves. The lesson had been delivered. In a world obsessed with the visible, with the logos, the labels, and the loud pronouncements of wealth, true power often resides in the unseen. Fomjia dignity was an invisible armor, and character was a currency they had never learned to value. And on that sun-drenched afternoon, on the pristine grounds of the Crestwood Estates, they had learned, to their everlasting regret, that some people are so wealthy they don't need to look rich.